Hi, Yinnies, and welcome back to a Yin Yoga podcast. So today is a solo episode, and I'm going to talk about what is therapeutic Yin Yoga. When I say that I teach therapeutic Yin Yoga, that I train teachers in therapeutic Yin Yoga, what in the world am I talking about? So that's what today is going to discuss. I'm going to talk a bit about what is therapeutic yoga, what is a yoga therapist, how that affected my Yin training, and then how I kind of merged all of these things together to teach what I call therapeutic Yin Yoga. Before we dive into that, though, just a friendly reminder that although I have the soul of a mermaid, I also have the mouth of a sailor. So if you have small people around, you might want to pause and add some headphones now. If you're offended by swearing, I can't guarantee there will be any in this episode, but it's possible. So just keep that in mind. Also, in this episode, I'll briefly be talking about trauma, just as a sort of general term, though, not going into any specific trauma instances or stories, but just a heads up that we'll be using the T word in a very kind of general sense. Okay, I think that's it. Shall we begin? Yes? If you're watching this on YouTube, you will notice that I'm going to be reading for a while. So if I'm not looking right at you at the camera, that's why. Part of my worry with making this episode is that I would leave things out. And so I have some notes to guide me. And I'll probably listen to it at the end and realize I left things out anyways. But just so that you know, for those of you watching, if you see my eyes moving around, that's why I have notes. Okay, so what do I mean when I say that I teach therapeutic yin? What does that even mean? Well, for me, it's a combination of yin yoga, yoga therapy, and then traditional Chinese medicine. So before I dive really deep into any of these, I'm going to just clarify how I'm defining these things. Because yoga is an unregulated industry, there is a little bit of a wild, wild west with how we use their words and what definitions things have. So I want to be really clear on how I'm defining these things before we get into it, just so there's no confusion. When I say yoga therapy, I'm talking about yoga therapy as it is defined by the International Association of Yoga Therapists. Because I am registered with them, my yoga therapy training was with a aligned teacher training programs, right? So one of the colleges that is recognized by the International Association of Yoga Therapists. So I'll be coming at the word yoga therapy from that angle, just to be clear about that. And when I talk about yin yoga, I will be talking about yin yoga as taught by Paul Grilley, my teacher. So I just wanted to clarify those two terms first, because again, sometimes people have different definitions of therapeutic yoga or yoga therapy, and some people have different definitions of yin yoga. So to be really clear as to where I'm coming from, there we go. Okay, so yoga therapy is a merging of all of the beautiful things about the yoga tradition. So the asana, the mantra, the mudra, the meditation, the pranayama, the philosophy, all of that, and current biomedical studies, or sort of a Western kind of medical understanding of what can be going on with the body. Now, here's the thing. Each yoga therapist under that is different with how much they tend to go more towards the yoga leanings and more towards the biomedical. But all yoga therapy training programs have a blend of both to some degree. Okay, so just to be a bit clear on that. So one definition that I like is that the practice of yoga therapy draws from the principles of yoga and incorporates the full range of yoga practices. Yoga therapists have an additional training in Western medical pathology and biomedical knowledge. And we use those insights along with all of the gifts that yoga has to offer, like asana, pranayama, meditation, mudra, mantra, etc., to help the student. Sometimes this is done in a clinical setting, although often not in my life, but sometimes it's done in a clinical setting, like in a hospital, right? Or sometimes it's one-to-one or with a small group setting that is suitable for the participants' needs. So what I mean by that is it's not like just your average group drop-in class, right? These are usually registered series and they're around a specific theme, like in my case, anxiety or back care, or, maybe mental health. So the small group theme has the people in it that, that would be applicable for. So it's very different than like a drop-in class where it's just kind of everybody coming and going. Okay, so when I say a small group setting, that's what I mean. So I wanted to read this definition by Gary Krafsow because I think it's a good one. Rather than focusing on yoga methods and practices, yoga therapists fundamentally focus on their clients' needs. So their job is to understand why their clients have come to see them, determine what it is that they can do to support them, and to help them in their work. So yoga therapists are often trained to assess clients through listening, questioning, observing, and for some appropriate touching. If you have training in that, not all yoga therapists have training in physically assessing. Yoga therapists look for ways to help their clients reduce or manage their symptoms, improve their function, and help them with both their attitude and their relation to their health conditions. After assessing clients, yoga therapists establish appropriate goals and create a practice intervention, and then teach clients to practice that intervention. It's not a great use of word, but it's a direct quote. In this sense, yoga therapists choose yoga techniques in relation to how they will specifically benefit the client. And I think that last line is probably the most important, in my opinion. So the difference between a yoga therapist and how they might sequence a class would be very different than just the average drop-in class. Because when you're a yoga therapist, you see everything through that lens. And so you're going to be evaluating who is in front of you. And then the sequence that you're creating is specific to that individual or small group's goals and needs, right? So it's not just, I created this warrior flow sequence because it's so fun and I love it. Nothing wrong with that, but that would not be a therapeutically minded sequence. When you're creating a sequence from a yoga therapist perspective, you're choosing the things from yoga that are going to be the most beneficial to who's in front of you. Here's another one that I quite like, and this is by Marie Quayle. Yoga comprises a wide range of body-mind practices, from postural breathing exercises, deep relaxation, and meditation. Yoga therapy tailors these to the health needs of the individual. It helps to promote an all-around positive health, as well as assisting with particular medical conditions. The therapy is particularly appropriate for many chronic conditions that persist despite conventional medical treatment. And this is often true, that as a yoga therapist, by the time that somebody comes to you, they've already tried several things. And they may be continuing with those things, like acupuncture, massage, chiropractic, who knows, right? Whatever the case may be. But they're not getting as much as they need. And that's when they often come to yoga therapy. I want to be really clear here, though, that yoga therapists do not diagnose. So one of the differences, and I'll talk a bit more about the differences between a regular teacher training and a yoga therapy training coming up, but one of the things that is the most significant, that I really want people to understand, is that as a yoga therapist, I am not diagnosing anyone. That is beyond my scope of practice. I am not a licensed medical professional, so I'm not diagnosing people. Now, sometimes they come to me with the diagnosis to my classes or for one-on-ones, in which case, they've already seen a mental health practitioner or a doctor or a chiropractor or whatever the case may be. And so they have a diagnosis already. So then I can take that diagnosis and I can use it to inform what I create for them as far as a practice, or what I'm going to put in that class based on what the needs of that small group are. But I'm not diagnosing it. That is beyond my scope of practice. I just want to be very clear about that, because I think that this is something that I really like about yoga therapy, that unfortunately most yoga teachers don't keep in the front of their mind, and I wish they would. This is why you'll often see in yoga Facebook groups, oh, my student has back pain, what should I do? There's no way to accurately answer that without an understanding of what is the root cause of that back pain. So as yoga therapists, we're very clear. If somebody comes to me and they've got symptoms that they don't have a diagnosis for, then I can still work with them, but I would refer them out to an expert that can help. So let's just say, for example, this is random, but somebody has incontinence. Well, I don't know for sure why that is. And so I can't really start to give them a sequence to help with that unless I know what the root cause is. So then I would refer them, for example, to a pelvic health PT or physiotherapist. So somebody who's done deep study in that area, so that I would then get the information back as to why this is happening, because there could be many different causes. So that's just one example. Here's another. Somebody comes to me with back pain. Now, sometimes they do that and it's just sort of the general sore and tightness from sitting at a desk and they've got knots, and that's very different than if they've got some, serious acute pain that they've been working through. In that case, I'm going to need to know, have they had any x-rays? Have they had any scans? Do they have any issues with their discs? Is it sciatica? Once I have an understanding of what is going on, that's when I can start to create this custom sequence just for them. So I just wanted to be very clear that that is one of the major differences between a yoga therapist and sort of a yoga teacher, is that oftentimes yoga teachers just have this, I don't know if you want to call it ignorance or hubris, to just say all kinds of things that they're actually not qualified to say and they shouldn't be offering advice on. Whereas a yoga therapist, one of the things that we vow to when we register with the International Association of Yoga Therapists is to stay within our scope of practice. So just wanted to get that out there, because sometimes people can hear yoga therapist and they can think, oh, I'm just like a physical therapist or a chiropractor or a doctor. Not the case. Okay. So on the note of yoga therapy, what is the difference in training between a typical yoga teacher, like a 2 or a 500 hour, and a yoga therapist? Well, here's just some of the additional things that we touched on in my yoga therapy training. This will not be an extensive list because that would take a really long time, but some of the things that stand out to me. Now, if you've listened to the episode where I introduced myself, you'll have already heard how I decided to become a yoga therapist, what I was doing before that. But just briefly, I was already working with people in a therapeutic way. I had been teaching yoga for, I think at the time of starting my yoga therapy training, like 15 years, or maybe it was 13, somewhere in there. So for quite a while. And so I already had a 200 and a 500 hour under my belt before I even embarked on my yoga therapy training. And so I had a lot of experience. I'd been around the block a little bit. My first teacher training was quite good. And it had a couple flaws, but generally speaking, quite good. And so there was that. And then also on top of that, I had been helping people with back pain for several years and had done a lot of mentorship in that area and things like that. So I already came into the program with like a good solid base of knowledge, but of course learned much more. And here are the things that kind of really stood out to me when I took my yoga therapy training that made it quite different from other trainings. So learning about mental health in so many different ways, There was a whole intensive on yoga therapy and mental health. It was like a 60-hour intensive. So, understanding kind of some of the common mental health conditions, whether it's something as common as anxiety or depression or, schizophrenia or other things. So having a better understanding of what those are and what they might look like, how they might affect our students. Trauma training. So I took trauma training, which I think every yoga teacher should take, whether they are a yoga therapist or whether they're just a yoga teacher teaching drop-in classes, because regardless of who you teach, if you're teaching the public, you're teaching people who have trauma. And I think sometimes people confuse the word trauma and they think that it means, that somebody has been sexually abused for most of their life. And that is definitely very traumatic. However, there are all kinds of trauma. There's divorce, there's car accidents, there's, it could be anything. So I think that sometimes we think that trauma has to have like a capital T trauma on it to affect us, but actually trauma happens all the time. If you're human, you've been through some trauma. It's impossible, I think, to not have. So, but what I did learn was about trauma and how it shows up in yoga. And I took a module on the therapeutic relationship. So this is where things like, our scope of practice and boundaries, things like that were discussed. Very wonderful training. I already discussed scope of practice in a bit more detail. So that was clearly mentioned and defined in this training. Additional biomedical studies. So we learned a little bit more about anatomy and common conditions like, arthritis or things like that. And also a better understanding of how actually to read some of those studies, because not all studies are created equal. And so, just saying, oh, there's a yoga study that says that blank condition can be improved with this yoga, you really have to look at that and see, what was the study, pick it apart a bit. But more of an understanding from a biomed perspective of conditions and injuries. Now, just as a sidebar, I also studied traditional Chinese medicine for a few years, which I'll talk about near the end of this. And as part of those studies, there were additional biomedical studies that I took. So I took, for example, anatomy and physiology, surface anatomy, pathophysiology, integrated physical examination. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but you get the idea. So there was a host of other courses that I took that actually I dove a bit deeper into sort of biomedical studies in those. In a yoga therapy program, there's also a big emphasis on mentorship. And this is something that's often missing in our typical 200 or 800 hour programs. So mentorship, where you're shadowing a teacher and you're able to ask them questions about why they did what they did and see the room and things like that. So that's one aspect of mentorship. And then you're able to ask questions. And then on top of that, there's a certain number of private sessions that you have to do under mentorship. So the mentor isn't there in the physical space with you, but you're working privately with people, you're keeping notes, you're checking in with your mentor, they're checking in with your notes to see if there's anything that they could add, or if you have questions, or there are situations where you weren't sure what to do. So that's part of the yoga therapy program. And then you also have to teach a certain number of registered therapeutic series, whether they be 6 or 8 week. And those are usually themed. So that might be I'm just going to use my examples, yoga for anxiety, yoga for back pain, yoga for sleep. So it's got a specific theme and it's a registered series. And you have to do several of those as well on your way to being certified. Generally speaking, most yoga teachers start with a 200-hour training, and then eventually they add on another 3 so that they can say they're a 500-hour certified yoga teacher. As it stands at the time of this recording, and this could change, a yoga therapist has 1,000 hours of training. So they're assuming that you already have at least a 200-hour, and then there's an additional 800 hours in your yoga therapy program before you can say that you are a certified yoga therapist. So that's a pretty big difference, right? So even if you already had a 500, it's an additional 300 on top of that. And it's a big difference. And I'm just going to say, and it might not be a popular opinion, I still don't think it's long enough. I actually feel like a yoga therapy program should be longer. Like, I feel like it should be like at least 2,000 hours. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. I just think because one thing that I noticed when I took my yoga therapy training is I came in with a certain amount of years of experience and teaching under my belt and already a therapeutic leaning and therapeutic mentorship. And so for me, the learning curve wasn't as big with some of these things. There were certain areas where it was, like, for example, in the trauma section, for example, back when I took my first teacher training, there was no such thing as trauma informed yoga or trauma sensitive yoga. It just wasn't a thing. So there was definitely areas where I learned a ton, and then there was areas where I learned very little. But what can happen is that you get a yoga teacher who's taken a 200-hour and they haven't even really dove into teaching yet. They don't have a lot of experience under their belt, and then they go right into their 800-hour. And I actually feel like that's a bit of a, I think that's a bit of a flaw in the system. I think that one of the requirements to joining a yoga therapy program should be a certain amount of experience and or teaching hours before you come in, because it lessens some of the confusion and also how much you have to learn when you're a newer teacher doing a yoga therapy program. And it also just gives you some more confidence and some more experience. So that would be my thoughts with that, is that sometimes you can have just a 200-hour and not a lot of experience and then enter into your yoga therapy training. Unfortunately, not my favorite. I wish that everybody had to have 500 hours and then they could enter their yoga therapy, and that would then be 800 hours or 1,500 hours or something. So I think there's a long way to go in the yoga therapy world, and I would like to see it be longer. There are some places, and at the time of recording this, I think there's one in the States where you can get a master's in yoga therapy, but unfortunately it's only one place and it's in the US. So not overly helpful, but I would love to see more of those popping up so that those that are already yoga therapists could then continue on to take their masters. That would be great. So that's a little bit about yoga therapy. Now, again, the word yoga therapy has not been trademarked. It can't be, really. So this is why you'll sometimes see people say that they teach therapeutic yoga, which I think is more accurate. If you teach yoga and you're not a yoga therapist, but you teach yoga with a therapeutic leaning, I think it's more accurate to say you teach therapeutic yoga, also more clear to your students. But when you say you're a yoga therapist, that can get a bit confusing because people are like, what do you mean by therapist? Do you mean like you're a counselor? Do you mean like you're a physical therapist? Like, what does that mean? So it can be a bit confusing. Hopefully that cleared some of that up. All right. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Yin Yoga. So that's kind of what makes therapeutic yoga different, or some of the many things. There's so many I probably did not mention. So Yin Yoga is a functional form of yoga. What I mean by that is it's not what the pose looks like that matters. It's what does it feel like, right? So all of these kind of like vague blanket alignment cues that work for some, but not for others, are not part of a yin practice. So there's no like right way or wrong way to do a pose unless you're injuring yourself. What we're looking at in a yin practice is the function of the shape that you're doing. So I'm doing this pose because I want to access this area. So that's functional. It's floor-based, so you rarely get off the floor. Occasionally, and I know that there's going to be confusion on this because there's a pose sometimes called dangling, which is described as a yin pose. From my training and my experience, that was only offered as a yin alternative pose. If somebody couldn't do seated forward folds and actually feel what they needed to feel based on their bone structure. So if they were, impinging at their hips as they folded forward, sometimes standing them up and getting them to dangle would get them past that because it would change the orientation of their pelvis. And so that would be their shape. But dangling or standing forward fold in my training, all of the 500 hours with Paul Grilley, was never taught as a yin pose. It's like hey, you could do this if. Okay, so just to be clear, floor base. So we're on the floor, we're sitting on the floor, we're laying on the floor. There's stillness. So rather than moving from pose to pose or moving within the pose, there's stillness. And the stillness is relative because, of course, you're going to come into a shape and then maybe partway through, you're going to notice your body's changed. And so maybe you adjust the pose, you change your grip, or you tweak it, or you grab a prop. So there is some movement, but it's not movement like in movement forms of yoga, right? We're not moving into one pose, flowing in from one pose to the other, nor are we moving in the pose itself. There's stillness. Longer holds than what you would find in a more movement or dynamic based practice. So this is a general rule of thumb, but like 2 minutes to 5, kind of for the average drop-in class. I know lots of experienced yin teachers and students that do holds longer than 5 minutes, but that's kind of a general rule of thumb. Shorter holds on the areas where the tissues aren't as dense, longer holds where the tissues are more dense. It may include the use of props. So I don't know where this idea came from, but I hear it sometimes that teachers will say that yin yoga doesn't use props. So I don't know where you got that idea, if that's what you've been told, but that is actually not the case. In fact, when I talked to Paul about this, my teacher, Paul Grilley, and said, where do people get this idea that you can't use props in yin? He was just as shocked as I was. So yes, if you look at the average yin book, you're not going to see a lot of prop usage, but you could say that for most books. Finally, the yoga publishing industry is starting to get a bit more accessible and show more options and props and things. But for many, many, many years, all you saw were people on a mat without a prop or on the floor without a prop doing the poses. So I don't know if that's where people get the idea that you don't use props in yin yoga, but that's not true. You can use props, and that does not make it a restorative practice. That's a topic for another time. There is a difference between restorative and yin, and it's not because you brought a bolster out that now you're doing restorative yoga. So it may include the use of props. When would we use props? Well, when we need to get the student or ourselves comfortable enough to begin to settle into the pose and to let it become passive. Because this is a passive practice. We're relaxing as much as we can into these shapes, not using our muscles to, to engage while we're in the practice. So sometimes we might need to prop, either to deepen sensation, to lessen sensation, or just to support an injury, or to just support the body so that you can stay in the shape and really let go. So may include the use of props. How much depends on the student and the practice. Yin yoga is a bit more meditative. It's often nicknamed the quiet yoga. So when we are in our shapes for minutes at a time, it really gives us an opportunity to work with our mind in a more meditative way than we would if we were moving quickly. It's what I often call an inside-out practice. So rather than focusing on the external part of the practice, like proprioception, like where is my body in space? And what does this pose look like? We're instead looking at the inside of the practice. What does this pose feel like? Is this version working for my body? Can I drop inwards and see what I'm feeling? And this is something called interoception, which, again, we may have a whole episode on that. So I'll just plant that for now. But interoception, awareness of what is happening inside. And although from the outside, yin yoga looks easy, like if you look at people just sitting on the floor for 2 minutes and you'd never experienced it, you'd think, oh, what are they doing? That's so easy. but it can actually be really challenging, but in a totally different way. Yin yoga can be challenging in the way that when you are in a society, as we are, where you are rushing from thing to thing to thing, and you are constantly doing and adding things to your to-do list, sitting still and being quiet can actually be really difficult. When you don't take time to sit still and be quiet on a regular basis, then there's all kinds of thoughts and emotions and things that we actually don't even know are in us because we're not paying attention, we're not dropping in. And so sometimes then when we do take that time in a yin practice or even a meditation practice to sit 4 minutes at a time and not move and be still, then the circus of our mind can come up. Okay, so the thinking and the planning and the list writing and the analyzing and the ruminating and the criticizing and the storytelling and the judging and the itching and the bitching and the twitching and all of that comes up. So although yin looks easy, it's actually quite challenging, but just in a different way, quieter way. Yin yoga works deeply into our body with passive held poses. And physically, its special superpower is that it affects the deeper tissues of our body, our connective tissues, ligaments, joints, the deep fascia networks of the body, and the meridians, but caveat, via the sinew channels. And the sinew channels are like the fascia channels that align with the meridians. Again, I'll have a future episode where I talk about that more, but sometimes people think that we're working with the meridians in a yin practice the same way that an acupuncturist would be, and that's not really very accurate. We're working with the sinew channel of each corresponding meridian. Whereas in yang or movement forms of yoga, those yoga practices tend to target the muscles. And in yin, we're looking at deeper tissues. So now that we've got a bit of an overview about what the heck is yoga therapy and a brief overview of what the heck is yin yoga, now I'm going to tell you what changed, because I was already a yin certified teacher when I took my yoga therapy training. And in fact, I did my last 100 hours with Paul, not my last in general, but because I plan to do that repeatedly, but the last of the 500, the one that got me to 500 with Paul while I was in my yoga therapy training. So there was a module that I used applied credit for. It was a yin module. And then while all my yoga therapy cohorts were doing that module, I ran away to California and studied with Paul again. And I'm going to say that although I say now that I teach therapeutic yin, initially I was very resistant to that name. I think because to me, I wish that all yoga was more therapeutic. I think it used to be. But I think in the day and age where yoga has become a workout and fitness, and there are yoga exercises and yoga drills, it's lost its therapeutic leaning sort of in the general culture. So I was resistant to saying I taught therapeutic yin simply because I thought that all yin should be therapeutic. But what I realized quite quickly in my studies is that actually what I was teaching as far as yin goes was quite different. That the yin that I was teaching when I became a yoga therapist and started tweaking things was different than the average yin class. So there was a couple of things that they had in common. And then there was some things that I had to change as I became a yoga therapist. I remember taking my trauma training and hearing her define trauma sensitive yoga, which, by the way, just to be a little bit anal, trauma sensitive yoga is a system of yoga trademarked by the Trauma Center. So you can't just go around saying you teach trauma sensitive yoga. They've kind of TM'd a term attached to trauma yoga, attached to trauma sensitive yoga, but you can say that you teach trauma informed yoga. And I know this sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. However, I also understand it from their perspective as well, that we don't want just anybody who's taken no specialized training at all to run around saying that they're teaching trauma sensitive yoga, because it is a bit of the wild, wild west in yoga. So there were some things that Yin Yoga and my yoga therapy definitely had in common that were totally cohesive. But then there were also some things that I was like, oh, I think if I'm going to keep teaching Yin, I'm going to need to figure out, how do I merge yoga therapy and Yin? And I had a little bit of a crisis of faith while I was in my trauma training. And then I realized that that was because I was trying to use the trauma center's definition of trauma sensitive. And in that case, actually, Yin is not a trauma sensitive, as defined by the trauma center, form of yoga. Neither is restorative yoga or yoga nidra. So I had to kind of sit with that and be like, I want to be a yoga therapist. I love Yin. How am I going to bridge this gap? So Yin yoga was already a functional form of yoga that acknowledges that each individual is different and therefore has different needs and different bodies. And so there's no one right way to practice the poses. So that was already thoroughly ingrained in me. That yoga therapy also sees it that way, that there's no right way for each person to do a pose, that it is individual. So that part was no paradigm shifting there. But what did change is I started teaching my Yin classes with a focus on the nervous system. So the nervous system set the stage for the whole practice. Literally, it sets the stage. The very first thing I do once we all say hello, check in, and pause for a moment of gratitude is I get them lying down in constructive rest, which, if you're not familiar with that, is just lying on your back with your knees bent, feet on the floor, and you can add props, which I do accordingly to make that more therapeutic, but that's the general shape, constructive rest. And I started all of my classes with that, because that particular shape is so therapeutic to the nervous system. It's like a nervous system remedy or tonic for many reasons in many ways. And I learned this in my yoga therapy training. So I now focus on the nervous system as the primary intention of my class. So the primary intention of my Yin classes is now nourishing people's nervous systems within the practice and scope of a Yin practice. So we start with a grounding and a centering while they're in constructive rest. I walk them through sort of a combination of going through the koshas and mindfulness to bring them from the external world, the day they've had, the world outside of the room, and gradually drop them into their own center. And that is the foundation of each class that I do. So there's a focus on the nervous system. That changed when I became a yoga therapist. Holding a trauma-informed space. So this can include agency, which Yin already does. Letting little changes, like letting people know when I'm moving around the room. This isn't something that ever occurred to me before I took my yoga therapy training and my trauma training, that if I get up to go adjust the lights or, lock the door, or that this might actually be a trigger for folks. So I started trying to look at, okay, if I'm not going to do full on trauma sensitive yoga, because I can't with Yin, how can I make this practice more trauma informed? And one of the things was the space. So agency, people can come and go as they need. People can come out of the poses as they need. They can grab whatever props they need. They can do a different pose if they need to. So total agency over their own bodies. Letting people know when I'm moving around the room. So saying things like, I'm just getting off of my mat to go adjust the heat. I'm now coming back to my mat, things like that. So I let them know where I'm going in the room and why. So I'm not just randomly walking around the room. That changed. If I have to lock a door, which sometimes you do in a space if you're teaching, I announce that I'm locking the door, and that I also tell them why. I'm locking the door to keep our privacy, or to allow the heat to stay in, or whatever the reason is. But please know that you can just unlock the door and leave at any time. Because for certain folks with certain traumas, just the sound of a locking door can be a trigger. So that wasn't something I ever thought of, but I do now. starting to use more invitational language. So instead of pick your right foot up and put it here, you might say something like, as you're ready, or in your own time, or you could try. So using language that is open and invitational instead of sort of directive language. Now, I'm not as completely undirected as I would be if I was teaching trauma sensitive yoga, but there's definitely a lot more invitational language and opportunity and agency there. I also had to sit with some of the common language that is used in Yin Yoga and decide if those were a fit for me. So things that I had never noticed before about language that I was trained with and that most Yin Yoga teachers use if they were trained by Paul or Bernie. It never occurred to me before, but once I had my trauma training, some of these words started making me go, I don't know if I want to use that word. So here's some examples. Edge. So I no longer use the word edge. First of all, the very term itself is can be triggering. I mean, what has edges? Cliffs, knives, it's just not only is it, could it be a bit triggering, it's also, I don't feel very accurate. Because when I come into a yin shape and I start to feel sensation, I'm not feeling an edge. An edge denotes that there's a line. What I'm feeling is a little bit more like a line in the sand, right? And it changes and it shifts from inhale to exhale. So not only did the word edge not feel accurate to me, it also felt like it wasn't very trauma-informed language. So I have now switched that to using the word sensation. I tell people that they can come in and feel sensation. Sensation is also a lot more open because what they might be feeling is stretch. Or if they're quite flexible, they've already reached sort of the limits of their bone structure and they're not feeling stretch in the pose, maybe they're feeling the sensation of chi moving through their body. So it's more open and I think more accurate. I also, oftentimes you'll hear Yin Yoga teachers say, come to 70% of the most you could do. From my experience, maybe it's just because I attract other recovering A-type personalities because I am one. But when I used to use 70%, I would see people white knuckling it through their yin practice, like there was somewhere to go, like they were competing, they were just pushing themselves and being super aggressive. I still see it sometimes, especially in seated forward folds. It's like everybody thinks if your hands are on your foot, you win the prize. So I switched the word I switched the word edge to sensation. And I also switched the degree of how much sensation. So I say now 50 to 60%, knowing that that means that those recovering A types will probably still be at 70, but at least they won't be at 100. And I also address this with humor in my class, right? So I don't say come to 70%, I say come to 50 to 60%. I'm truly interested in the middle way, what the Buddha would have called the middle way, right? Not too much, not too little, finding that. And that changes because one breath into a pose, 2 breaths into a pose might be different than your first breath into a pose. So this is why I don't use the word edge, I use sensation. And when I talk about how much sensation, I say 50 to 60%, and know that that is a movable amount of sensation, that it will change over the course of time. I also don't use the word target. That's, I mean, we shoot at targets. We aim arrows at targets. In corporate world, they have financial target. It just isn't a word to me that feels, first of all, trauma informed, but also accurate. Again, I'm going for accuracy as well, because I, as a teacher, might have, your hip, butt, IT band in mind as the target for this pose. But in your body, maybe your hip, butt, IT band is quite open that day. And so as you draw your leg in like a figure 4 lying down or something, you actually are feeling that in your hamstring. So does that mean they're doing it wrong? No. And so instead of target, I use the word intended. The intended area for this shape is, you may be feeling it somewhere else, right? I'm always going to say, but you may not be feeling that, you may feel it somewhere else, or you may not notice sensation at all. but I use the word intended instead of target. This one I still slip up occasionally, and it depends if I'm talking to yoga teachers or not. But I try to use the word, instead of the word pose, I use the word shape. And the reason I use the word shape is because, again, there are certain populations that have been posed. So whether they're a model and they've got some trauma around that, anyone who has been, sexually abused and had photographs taken of them. So the word pose can be a bit loaded as well. So I just turn that word into shape. This is a yin shape for blah, blah, blah. The other word that I stopped using was the word rebound. And this one wasn't because I think that word isn't trauma informed. It again just didn't feel accurate to me. A rebound to me feels like it's kind of like a quick snapback. And that's not what I feel or what my students feel in the practice. So I use the word resonance or linger because that feels more accurate to me. When I come out of a long held yin shape and I've got that urge to sort of moan and groan and come out of the shape, when I feel sort of that feeling of unfamiliarness in my body, the resonance of that pose or the linger of the shape that I was just in is still very present in my body. And then that resonance or that linger starts to soften and fade and fade and fade until I feel more like my familiar self again, right? And so the word rebound just doesn't denote that to me. It's more subtle and more stretched out than that. So I use the word resonance or linger. I want to just mention too, because a lot of times people think that if you study with a teacher and then you change the way you're teaching, that you're being disrespectful. And the last time that I was with Paul and studying with him while I was in my yoga therapy training and starting to come up with some of these words that was like, these words just aren't sitting right with me anymore. I mentioned it to him. I said, I'm taking my yoga therapy training. This is what I'm learning. And I'm just finding that some of the words that we use in yin are either not feeling accurate or not feeling as therapeutic as I would like. And he looked at me very matter-of-factly, because this is the way Paul is. And he said, well, you should use whatever words work for you and your students. So the reason I mention that is because sometimes as teachers, we get dogmatic, right, about certain things. And we think that we're doing that because that's the way our teacher told us and we're being loyal to the teacher. But actually, my teacher, and any teacher who I would ever call my teacher, is super open and encouraging to us learning to explore, think outside the box, and use critical thinking, and then choose for ourselves. So I just wanted to mention that because I'm sure some of you listening to this got a little bit like when you heard me saying I was relanguaging the yin practice. So if Paul can be okay with it, maybe you can too. Okay. The other things that started to change when I started teaching yin from a therapeutic mindset was explaining to new students the mental and emotional aspects of a still quiet practice. I have a little story about that. So when I did a teacher training at the yoga therapy college that I took my training at, I used to lead their yin modules. And one of the ones that I did, a teacher came up to me on the break and she was very teary-eyed and she said, "Thank you so much." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "For talking about the mental and emotional parts of this practice. I've been to a yin class before and the teacher didn't say anything. It was just take this shape, here's the time," and then was totally quiet. And she said she was freaking out in her poses. She was having all kinds of emotions come up. Her mind was going all over the place. And she thought, "I hate this practice." So to me, that's a bit heartbreaking because here's the thing. We all, as humans, have these busy brains that are going to kick up a storm when we're in a quiet practice like this. This is totally normal. And so I normalize that to my students. If you're trying to work with somebody therapeutically and they're about to walk into a completely foreign situation, where they're unprepared, they have no idea what's going on, and their nervous system might be a bit triggered. I mean, don't you think it would be nice to just say, hey, here's what you can expect here, just so you know, and you're not alone, because we're all having this soap opera going on in our mind. So I started explaining to the new students the mental and emotional aspects of this still quiet practice. The fact that the mind stuff can come up, that this is normal, and offering some anchors for practice. So, I'll give them some simple concentration techniques. They always have the option to use whatever anchor they'd like to, or ignore my advice on using an anchor altogether if that's what serves them. But I give those new students a little bit of information about, here's how this practice is different. Here's how it can affect the mind. If you notice that you're thinking and planning and list writing and all the things, just know that's totally normal. Everybody in this room is doing that. Here are some things you could use if you would like to work with your mind, right? Makes a big difference. So giving an understanding of the busy mind, creating a sense of normalcy around the mind stuff, and then offering anchors to practice with if they would like to take them. The other thing I want to mention, and I see this often in yoga forums too, is that, do you give hands-on adjustments in yin? No. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about going over and handing a student a prop, right? I do that. I let people know if I'm walking around, I'll say, because I'm teaching in a trauma-informed space, I'll say, I'm just moving around the room to help some of your yoga friends get more comfortable. You can follow my voice and know where I'm at. So if I see that someone is struggling and that I could put a block under their foot or a blanket under their head or whatever it is that would get them more comfortable, that would allow them to settle into that shape, I'm definitely going to offer that. But otherwise, it's hands off. Okay, so this is a trauma-informed perspective, right? You don't teach a trauma-informed class and touch your students. It's just not a thing. That being said, of course, this is up to you, but I am teaching a trauma-informed class. Paul and Susie never touch us. Never once did they walk around the room giving us adjustments. If we needed them and we called on them and we're like, Paul, Susie, I can't feel this, or this is happening in my body, then they might offer a prop or a touch or give you an alternative pose. But to be clear, the touch was to get you more comfortable, not to deepen sensation, not to push you further into the pose. In my opinion, whether you're teaching yin or any other style of yoga, this is a very outdated way to teach. If you are putting your hands on your students to try to deepen their pose, I would really question whether or not that's actually serving the needs of your students. Now, there can be therapeutic touch in different ways if you have the training and the modality to do that. So for example, I have lots of hands-on bodywork training. I took some in my yin training. I've taken Thai yoga massage. I've learned physical integrated medicine courses where I actually physically assess people. I have taken medical Qigong training when I did my Chinese medicine studies. So I can use those skills because I have the training in it. But what I'm never doing is trying to push somebody deeper into a pose than what they can do themselves. So there's my rant on that. But definitely, if you're trying to teach therapeutically, it's hands-off. Also, what changed when I took my trauma training and then I started going into my yin classes, and I would see that someone was having a trauma response, I now knew what it was. Whereas before my therapeutic training, when I would see people doing certain things in my class, I'd always be confused. Like, what's up with that? Did they not understand what I just said? Why aren't they doing what I just said? What's going on over there? I would be confused. Now, I would never be aggressive or pushy. Would never tell people they had to do what I was saying. But I would be lost and confused as to like, what is going on when people would either disassociate or they wouldn't do things, or there's all kinds of things. And this is not the podcast for that, but all kinds of things that can come up in a yoga class that could be a trauma response. So when I took my yoga therapy training, I now knew what that might look like. And that is so amazing to have that gift. And to not only know what does it look like, but also what do you do about it or not do about it? Again, this is beyond the scope of this particular podcast, but we will do ones in the future on that. So when I see someone, once I have my therapy training in a yin class, having a trauma response to the practice, I now know A, that's what that is, and B, what to do about it or not to do about it. Didn't have that knowledge before. And then the last thing I'll say about what changed when I started shifting to teaching yin from a therapeutic perspective is the role of emotions and speaking to it when it's needed. I want to be really clear here, though. I am not talking about saying, did you know that all of your grief is stored in your chest? Or did you know that like your emotions are stored in your hips? That's actually irresponsible, in my opinion, to tell students that, because then if they don't ever experience anything from doing a hip opener, they think that something's wrong with them. Or if they experience a different emotion in a different part of their body, now they think there's something wrong with them. What I mean by the role of emotions and speaking to it when needed is sometimes our students have not had any time to be still and quiet and to process emotions that have been coming up for them based on whatever they're going through in their life. They're grieving, whatever it is. And so these can come up in the yin room. And this could look like a student crying. This could look like a student being super irritated and impatient and frustrated while they're doing their practice, like a lot of like exasperated sighs and like being super fidgety and just like really having a lot of trouble emotionally, being irritated, frustrated, etc. Okay. Sadness. These are the common ones. So I don't address the role of emotions in my intro in a class, but what I do is if I see them occurring, I'll speak to them so that people know that what they're experiencing is normal. Again, normalizing this inner experience. What they're experiencing is normal and that they're not alone. So for example, if somebody started crying, I wouldn't start right as they started, but partway through, I might say something like, another thing that can happen in a yin practice, because we haven't allowed ourselves this time to sit still and be quiet and process emotions, is that sometimes the emotions come up while we're here in this practice. So to be clear, it's not yin yoga that's causing the emotions, but you're allowing yourself an opportunity to be still and quiet and to process. And so these may come up. So I might say it like that. Okay, so I never would have discussed that role of emotions before I had my therapeutic training, nor would I have probably known what to do with it very much. Okay, so far we're getting near the end here. So far we've talked about what the heck is yoga therapy. We've defined yin yoga, and then I've told you a bit about what changed for me when I became a yoga therapist, started taking yoga therapy training, and how that affected my teaching of yin. And there's one more element that I define as therapeutic yin. So when I'm saying that I teach therapeutic yin, there's one more element that comes in. So I decided, after some healing that I had experienced with my own body, with traditional Chinese medicine, and my studies with Paul, and getting a little bit of a vague understanding of like yin yang theory, although not in depth, and kind of a little bit of meridians, again, not in depth, that I was really interested in studying Chinese medicine. And so I did for almost 3 years. I did not complete the program because I realized partway through that I wasn't very excited about putting needles in people. It wasn't gross or weird or scary. It just kind of left me going, meh. So I adore Chinese medicine still to this day. I hope to do my medical Qigong training. That's where I was headed when COVID hit, which has sidetracked a few things, but that is kind of where I'm going to take all of this Chinese medicine knowledge that I learned in my Chinese medicine training and kind of branch it into that with some additional training. So that's where it's going. But some of the things that I learned when I decided to study TCM, and I include these also in my classes and in my teacher trainings, is sort of the role of Chinese medicine in yin yoga. What is like yin yang theory, Taoist and Chinese medicine philosophy, because Taoism and Chinese medicine cannot be pulled apart. They are interconnected, interwoven. An understanding between the difference between meridians and sinew channels and how that actually affects the practice. I learned more about, of course, the relationship between fascia and the channels, so the sinew channels. I learned, of course, the anatomy, location, function of the 6 yin and 6 yang channels, as well as the Ren and the Du channel and the extraordinary as well. I learned more about the organs associated with each channel from a Chinese medicine perspective. The mental and emotional qualities of each channel, again, from a Chinese medicine perspective. Taoist 5-element philosophy, including seasonal influences, an individual's constitution, the roles and function of qi, the role of jing or essence, and the spirit or the soul that is connected to each of the organs. So I spent in between 2.5 and 3 years diving deep into Chinese medicine studies, and also I mentioned some additional biomedical studies at college here in Victoria, where I live, called Pacific Rim College. And I basically took all of the classes that I could in traditional Chinese medicine before it's now all about needling. And I did take the first 3 of the needling class. That's when I decided this wasn't for me. 3 classes in, started needling and was like, I'm somehow unenthusiastic about doing this. So I decided to stop that program. And actually, that's when I dove into my yoga therapy training. So when I say that I teach therapeutic yin, this is what I mean, right? So as a yoga therapist, I see the world through that lens. As a 500-hour yin teacher, I'm taking all of my yin training and then all of my traditional Chinese medicine studies. So it's like a trifecta of like yoga therapy, yin yoga training, Chinese medicine, all wrapped up together. And that's what I teach. So when I say I teach therapeutic yin yoga to my students or to teachers when I train them, that's what I mean. Well, I hope that this was helpful for some of you and understanding more a bit of kind of like what is therapeutic yoga or how Chinese medicine might affect yoga. This is very much an overview, but I just thought it makes sense, since we're fairly early in the podcast, to define this, because throughout future episodes, I'm going to be saying I teach therapeutic yin. And if you don't know what that is, then that might be confusing. So I hope that you found this helpful. And by all means, you can always ask questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave them in the comments, or you can always contact me and add questions, ask questions, and I'm happy to answer, whether that's through my website or wherever it is that you've stumbled across this. All right, my friends, that is all. I think I've been prattling on more than enough about therapeutic yin. I hope you found it helpful, and I will talk to you again in the next episode. Thank you. Bye for now.